14th of the month of Tammuz. Hayom Yom. The Tzemach Tzedek notes in one of his discourses as follows. On Tuesday of Parshas Balak, our master, referring to the Alter Rebbe, of blessed memory, said to his son as follows. Here's what he said. This is interesting. Hayom Yom. To understand the problem posed by the astronomers, what's their problem? The problem is that they say, since the earth is round and spherical like an apple, why do the people who live on the side of the globe opposite to ours, down below in America, why don't they fall off? First of all, interesting their perspective, right? The upper half of the globe was across the Atlantic toward the east, and the lower half is across the Atlantic toward the west, the Americas. I mentioned to you the other day that Matan Torah only hit the first half of the globe, and only later, through the excruciatingly difficult process of exile, after exile, ultimately the exile of World War II, many religious people settled over here in Kadar HaTachton, and that's when the Torah came and was given into the Americas. That's just an aside. So that was their perspective, the upper part of the world and the lower part of the world. So if this is the lower part of the world, why don't we fall off? Good question. Their answer is not the true one. The answer all about the gravitational fields or whatever the answer is. Our master of blessed memory gave a very simple, and the root of the answer, the godly answer, the perspective of reality that we have, that the Torah gives us. The answer lies in the explanation of the Eitz Chaim, that the 9 spheres are nurtured by that state termed Igulin. This harks back to 9 spheres, right? We have spheros, the 10th of which, it depends how you look at it, is Keser, and that's the way we're looking at it, that the 10th is Keser, the crown, and the crown is different. The crown isn't a vertical, that's top and bottom. Why don't people on the bottom fall off? Keser is all-encompassing. Keser is, we've learned, right? Keser is the Or Makif, the accompanying, the circular. And in a circle, there is no above and below. Any point on the circle is on the circle, but there's no top or bottom to a circle. When we look at it on a page, we could say top or bottom, but that's the vertical structure. The structural dynamic of circularity is that there is no top or bottom. So there is no down below. The heaven over them is above, exactly the same as the heaven over us. And the earth there is below, relative only to the heavens over it. So it's because of the Or HaSoive that there really is no top and bottom to the earth. Okay. But there is a structure of top and bottom, which is Mamaliko Almin, and there are various levels in Mamaliko Almin, and those levels have to do with levels of Tshuva. Well, a lot of other things, but levels of Tshuva is our topic here today. Remember, there were, Zohar says, the word Tshuva says, Tashuv, the word Tshuva is Tashuv Hey, to return the Hey. And it's remarked that there are 2 Heys in the word Tshuva, in the name of Hashem. Yud Ke, Vav Ke, there's the first Hey and the second Hey. And they correspond to Shuva Ilah, the top kind of Shuva, the higher kind of Shuva, and Shuva Tato, the lower kind of Shuva. And also yesterday, the Alter Rebbe, he told us that. And he also asked a couple of questions that we see that for different kinds of sins, there are various punishments. Of the most serious, the punishments are death or being cut off. And yet we see that sometimes someone who committed very atrocious averas lives much longer. And that he's left us with a question, how is that? If they're chayav death or cut or being cut off, why don't they die immediately? Or even if they're prescribed to die that some years later, we see sometimes people who are chayav koros or misa live long lives. So he left us with those questions yesterday, and he's going to bring us around. Eventually, we will be able to address those questions, but not quite yet. But continuing the story, page 1037 in Lessons in Tanya, and in Likutei Amorim, yeah, page 186, near the bottom of the page, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines up from the page, and from the bottom over on the left. Yeah, okay. The line begins with a parenthesis, Shnehem in parentheses, and now over on the left. So to begin to understand some of this, the idea will be understood. This topic will be well understood. Al Pima Shekasav, according to how we understand the following sentence from Devorim. Devorim 22:9 says, Ki chelak Hashem amoy, a part of God is his people. That itself needs to be understood. God has no parts, but we're called a chelak elakah, a part of God. His people are a part of God. Now that means we're a chelak m'shem havaya. We're a part of the name Havaya. All right, that gives us something because the Shem Havaya has 4 letters, right? And so we could say there's God, Yud Ke Vav Ke, a unity, but it presents itself in 4 broad characteristics, Yud Ke Vav Ke, and connected with some of those, or one or more of those characteristics, are the Jewish people. We're part of that. Because Kesiv, as is written, now how do we see this? We see this, he's going to give us 2 expressions which help us understand this. First of all, when it comes to the creation of us Jewish humans, it says, V'yipach ba'apov nishmas chayim. Now, of course, this was said to the whole generality, the creation of humanity in the first place. And without going into details, humanity walked some straight and some crooked roads, and those sparks divided up into various different nations. But the root of humanity, and the root of our soul in particular, which has remained intact, as we'll talk about as we go on, is what's called a chelak elakah mimal, a part of God. But which part? A deep part, as indicated by the expression, "B'yipach b'avik." He blew the soul into the living. He blew a soul, a living soul, and the Zohar says, "Uman denachach." A person, when he blows, b'toichei nachach, he blows from very deep within him. Even though, of course, God doesn't have a body, the Torah gives us these anthropomorphisms and metaphors to describe it, so we can have a handle on this to some extent. As he says, the Torah speaks, as it says in Gemara Bruchas, in the language of men, in order that man can have some grasp of godliness, metaphorical. Mishle, the whole book of Mishle, Proverbs. In fact, the Torah itself is called Moshel HaKadmoni, the primordial metaphor. So this is the metaphor. But it's effective. It's something that we can learn from, that the root of our soul is from a very deep place. It's equivalent to blowing, as opposed to, as he's about to say, speaking. Just like there's a very big difference in a person, in regard to a person down here below, al daruk mashil, by way of a metaphor, bein hahevel sheyotzi mipiv, between the breath that comes from the mouth, bidibure, when a person speaks, the hevel hayetze al naficha, to the depth of breath that comes out when a person blows. Right? Fairly obvious. It takes much less power to bring words from the mouth than it does, say, to blow a tuba or a trombone or any instrument that comes from down deep. Because when a person speaks, there's only a small amount of life force in the spoken word, the spoken breath, relative to the blowing breath. And that's a relatively external breathing, is when you speak. From the enlivening soul, which is within you. However, when a person blows from the level, when a person brings forth from the level of blowing, and the teicha nachas, from very deep is this blowing coming from. There is enclosed in it a much deeper, more internal, deeper power from the soul than when a person speaks. Excuse me, I'm going to have to mute everybody again. Someone's off mute. Muting everybody in the lounge. Okay. Yeah. So, having said that, and having trying to adjust, there we go. So, kocha mamish. So, similarly, in exactly the same way, of course, by way of an alderech mashal, by way of a metaphor. Hamavdil havdolos lein case, which the metaphor, the analogy and the analog are very distant apart. The analogies being the breath, the analog being Hashem's enlivening power itself, even though there's a very big separation. Yesha hefresh atzam ma'oid l'mayla, so we can, however, apply this difference, this metaphor, up above to the creation. So we said that when it came to man, Hashem blew the yipach ba'apo of nishmas chayim, he blew a living soul. Now, when it comes to the rest of the creation, then kol tzavah hashamayim, we're going to make a distinction between all the hosts of heaven and a man, a human. V'afila hamalachim shenivru ma'ayin liyesh, even the angels, which, like everything else, come from this so-called state of nothing, where there's no thing, no differentiation, and become differentiated things. And their life force is coming from the externality of God's life force. And the flow that Hashem causes to flow, the flow of godly energy from the Ein Sof Baruch Hu to enliven worlds. This is the angels, and remember when he comes to speaking, when it comes to creating worlds, he says, he speaks, let there be light, let there be rakia. This is all speech. So what we're saying here is the angels and other supernal beings and the whole of creation is coming from speech, right? And this is called Shidzu Nikras B'Shem Ruach Piv, the breath of his mouth. In fact, there's a pasuk, yes, which is about to bring. Okay. With the breath of his mouth, all the hosts of heaven were created. And this is the life force which is enclosed in all of the things that were created in the 10 speeches, right? The externality. Remember, this is talking ultimately about the hey. Remember, hey motzosa peh, there are 5 articulated, number hey, 5 articulated powers of the mouth. And yet there's a hey Eloah, there's the first hey in Hashem's name, and there's the second hey in Hashem's name. So the externality, the second hey, is what brings, this is being, by way of analogy here, being likened to the speech of Hashem. And all the hosts of heaven and all the creation is spoken into existence from the 10 Maimoros.
Avi? Question?
Yeah.
So all of this is anthropomorphized.
More anthropomorphic, yeah.
Yeah.
Correct.
So when we say Hashem speaks, what does that mean?
Well, he's telling us what it means. It means there are levels of godliness. There's the one where before there's any levels at all, there's Hashem, who is B'yichud Gamur. He's complete onlyness. There's only him.
Right.
But he begins a process, which is called Tzimtzum. And that process brings forth many levels, right? So the first is from a deep source, right? Before the articulation. And then from a lower source, a more extraneous, external source, comes the articulation. So we're talking here about, we're not talking about the etzem itself, that's being left off the table for the moment. We're talking about those levels of tzimtzum which are either closer to his essence, that's the breath, deep in his chest, or farther from his essence.
So we're talking about limitations, but how does that correlate with speech? articulations.
Well, think about this. When you articulate, as I'm
Yeah,
articulating, you are creating quite a lot of different limitations, aren't you not? Through your look at my lips, and as a result, if you were in front of my mouth, you'd feel actually various different kinds of
vibration.
embodiments of the air,
Right.
right? It's all broken up. When I blow, it's one.
So the articulations are actually the limitations.
The articulations are the limitations, and they're responsible for all the hosts of heaven, the angels, and the creation of all the worlds.
Shkayach.
The worlds are spoken into existence, they're not blown into existence. What's blown into existence is the soul of a human being, particularly a Jewish soul.
That means that we're unlimited.
That means that we have no boundaries whatsoever.
I was thinking that when we say that Hashem blew a soul within us, and if we're saying that the flow of energy is what gives life to the world, then that would mean that the pneumius neshama within us is also a continuous flow. It's not something that happened in the past when we were born.
Correct.
But every
Absolutely.
day when we say Shachazarta Binishmasi,
right,
that you return my soul to me, it is a continuous flow of pneumius within us.
You're absolutely right. And of course, you're saying this because you remember the very first page of Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, where the Baal Shem Tov told us, based on a pasuk, that Hashem is continually bringing everything into existence all the time. And if he were to stop either speaking for the creation or blowing for the Jewish and human soul, everything would revert back to the ayin, to the nothing it was before the Tzimtzum.
And it's not just in the morning, it's every time we take a breath.
Every breath you take and every move you make. Exactly. Al derech mashal, and whoever, and Rona, you said, this is al derech mashal. This is a way of an anthropomorphic metaphor. And the Torah uses this metaphor. The Torah itself, it says, Uberuach piv kol tziva'om. With the breath of his mouth, this is the articulating of the breath in his mouth, not in his deep chest. Kol tziva'om. All the hosts of heaven and all the worlds were created. That itself is a, right, let's translate it. So, and that's the level of life force which is in the letters of the 10 speeches. I mean, calling Asura Maimoras, this is also, of course, a metaphor. You don't, a human being can't hear the voice of Hashem speaking the world into existence. That's a metaphor for the fact that the world and the hosts of heaven and all the angels are being brought into existence continually, as long as he wants them to be, through this rather external part of the tzimtzum, of the contraction, the more farther away from essence part of the tzimtzum, which is called metaphorically speech, in the same way that speech is the outcome of a much deeper breath. And these, what are these letters in the 10 utterances? Why are there 10 utterances? Because they are indicative of the 10 spheros, the 10 ways, different ways in which Hashem brings things, and the tools, the 10 different tools that he uses to bring things into existence. It's like a writer or a poet, who's also a writer, but, who uses the language and different combinations of letters in the language, but the language to convey much deeper meaning. So there's a deeper meaning, which is the elokus and everything, but what's superficially is the letters, and the letters bring the form of everything into existence. These are the 10 utterances. Shehen mechilas kelim, as he says, these are vessels or tools, hamshachas, and they're representative of different kinds of drawings down and out of godly energy. Can we remember back there? First part of Tanya, Chelik Beis. Chelik Beis is Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, which is Chelik Beis Perek Yud Aleph. Okay, now there's a very big difference between all of that, Ubein Neshamas Adam, and the soul of an Adam. Shenimshechat Techila Mebechinas Penimius Achayos. which the life force of an Adam is drawn at the outset, at the beginning. Where does Adam? The yipach be'apav. He blew into his nostrils, which is a panemius chayas, a much deeper, inner kind of life force. The hashefa and a flow, shemashbia ein saborahu, which the Infinite One, blessed be He, causes to flow. Kamashikosav, as it says, this is by the creation of Adam, the yipach be'apav nishmas chayim, right, which he quoted at the beginning. The achachach, and afterwards, after the blow, yoder b'seisa hamadregas, the breath comes out in hidden levels. These are the tzimtzum, where tzimtzum is concealment of the essence of Hashem. And that becomes, it comes out through levels of hiddenness, through until the breath becomes articulated metaphorically through the 5 articulated powers of God's mouth, right? And it becomes speech. And what does he say then? Nase Odom, he speaks. Nase Odom B'Tzalmenu. So the root of us is the breath, is the panemius of Chayas of Elokim. Well, the panemius of the Chayas of God. Let's reserve the word Elokim because it's a different, we'll talk about that in a minute. It's the panemius, the root of our soul, which we always have within us, is always there, is the deepest part of Hashem's life force. And then when it comes to creating the body, for instance, and everything that has shape and parts and components, so that's done through speech. It says, B'ma nasa Odom, and the human was created nasa Odom, just like the others. Let there be desha, let there be greens, let there be trees, let there be the rakia, right? That's all through the speech. And the word of speech that creates us in the level of feeling ourselves to be something separate from Hashem is the speech, Nasa Odom B'Tzalmenu Kidemusenu. Let us create man in our image and in our copy. Now, let man be a copy of us and an image of us. And that's in order that the soul, which is a chelek Hashem, a part of Hashem's, and constitutes that deep level of Hashem, should be invested in a physical body, in this world, in Elamazeh Tachton, in this lower world. And therefore, Nikru HaMalachim, therefore the Malachim, right, who are created beings on the spiritual level, they're called B'Shem Elokim. They're called Elokim, known as plurality, right? Plurality. Plurality is a function of Tzimtzum. Elokim is the name of the level of godly energy which is responsible for plurality and multiplicity and differentiality and separateness. B'Shem Elokim. So the Malachim are called B'Shem Elokim, as is written in Pasuk. It's in where's the header note? It's in Tehillim 33:6. No, wrong note. It's in Devarim 10:7. It says, Ki Havaya Elokechem, Havaya, your God, Elokei o Elokim. He is the God of other godly forces. Right? So here is the root, a root of many gods. Because the Torah uses that. Right? Elokei o Elokim. He's the God of gods. So this can give rise to Avodah Zorah also, which it did. Right? Humanity started worshiping the secondary or tertiary forces in the heaven and forgot about the root. That's what the Rambam very nicely in the Mishnah Torah describes how Avodah Zorah originated. Because Hashem hid himself, his very self, in the Shem Elokim. The Shem Havaya is a manifestation of himself. The Shem Elokim, plurality, is a concealment of singularity, and that's the name. The name that is given to that the state of plurality is Elokim, Elokechem, and that's what it says here. Ki Havaya, Havaya is Elokechem. Havaya is your God. Havaya, the Yud Kei Vav Kei, is the source of all the myriad multiplicities which are going to come from there. Elokehu Elokim, he's called the God of gods. Haidula Elakim. It says, Helala Elakai Aki Elakim. Give praise to the one who is the God of gods. No, it's interesting. I'm just remarking myself as I'm saying that. You can see how easily that leads to, okay, he's the God of gods, right? So analogously, there's a king over multiple nations, and the multiple nations each have their governor. And if you need help, you don't go to the king, you go to the governor of the place. And that's the prototype of Avodah Zorah. So, Hedul Elakeho Elakim. The Yovai B'nei Elakim. Again, he uses another pasuk. The children of Elakim, they stood up. Again, the children of, in the dimension of plurality. Back to our root muscle, breath is singular. It's not yet articulated. Speech is articulation of breath, which is multiplicity. And if that's the way you perceive God, and only the way you perceive God, then you're perceiving godliness expressed in multiplicity in various types of energetics, which we call gods, God of gods. And why is there plurality over here? Because the life force that's being invested in these hosts of heaven and in all the worlds is coming from a relatively external place. The more tzimtzum, the more sense of multiplicity. The less tzimtzum, the more sense of essence. So it's coming from that place of which is chitzonius, external, shehi bechinas ha'oisius levad, which is just the letters. Now we know the letters from other places rooted very deeply, but they're expressed in an alphabet of a certain number of letters. Number, diversity, multiplicity, is equals to externality. The Shem Elokim hu bechinas chitzonius, as it now says. The Shem Elokim, plural, right? And we use that word, is representative of a relatively external aspect of godliness, Lagabe Shem Havaya Baruch Hu, in relation to the Shem Havaya, Yud Ke Vav Ke, which is representative of a more internal and more unified and singular existence. Aval. Okay, that's all about the multiplicity. Aval Nishamis Ha'adam, Nishmas Adam, the soul of a human. And particularly, we're speaking about the Jewish human. Shehi bebechinas penimius achayos, which comes from the inner dimension of the life force. He chelek shem havaya baruch hu. Chelek, that's where we get chelek elekamima. This is where it comes from. It's a part of God above. It could be confused because it doesn't say chelek eleka. It's a part of God, shem havaya, mamish. And the shem havaya, yud ke vav ke, is indicative of a rooted singularity as opposed to a more external multiplicity. Kishem Havaya, as he says now, Moira al Penimius Achayas. The Shem Havaya, Yud Ke Vav Ke, it's still four, right? 4 letters, but it's the inner dimension of the Chayas. It's not God himself. It's the contraction of God into the Yud, and then the expansion in the Hey, and then the drawing down of the Vav, and then a lower level of expansion. But relative to Elohim, it's certainly way, way much deeper, much closer to the singularity of the essence of God himself. And therefore, the Shem Havaya, Moral Panimius Achayas, it shows on the inner dimension of godly vitality, which ultimately is much higher than any letters. That's today's Tanya. We're on the road to understanding Tshuva, and more particularly to understand what that means in terms of our every moment that we're in life on this planet. What does it mean to be in a constant state of returning, constantly returning to the singularity, which is our essence? Okay.
So I had a thought.
Yeah.
That you have to think in order for your speech to be from your neshama.
Right.
And most of the time, our speech is more superficial than that. It takes a conscious decision to pray to Hashem from the Shema, or definitely in our communication with another. That is part of it. Like, it's true that the tzaddik is inherently a tzaddik, but if I remember all of the times that I remember going to a tzaddik, there is something about the way they speak to you that is very much from soul.
Soul to soul. That's why the words are so powerful. Because they come from such a deep level. They hit your deep level.
The words are not just said. And just very little of our communication with others is, like we say, let's say you go to a wedding and say Mazel Tov to 100 people. Very little of that is heartfelt. It's like just, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. While if we would put in the effort for it to be heartfelt, it would be a different communication.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying, heartfelt. Devorim hayotzi min halev, right? Words which come from the heart go to the heart. And the heart is deeper than the mouth. And so you're saying, basically, you're giving us a little insight, metaphor, applying this metaphor, that a person can, think in just an average relationship. I mean, the words can be, do you really mean what you're saying? But when a person comes from the heart and expresses it really more with the body than with the speech, you get a feel for what's really going on. And that's what we're saying. The deeper levels are more expressive of the essence, and that's the Hashem Havaya. And the more superficial levels are more expressive of the superficiality. And the worlds in that muscle that you're using, the soul is deep in the heart, and when you express it, you're expressing heartfelt, and talk is cheap from that perspective. Talk is cheap. Talk only creates all the worlds. That's it.
But what you said before, that breath from the inside, that's one. And talk, that kind of separates into the 5 motzas hapeh, into boundaries and limitations. What Rosie just said, actually, first of all, I don't think it necessarily has to come from thought, because let's say a niggun, for example, if you look at a niggun with no words, that's one. That comes from the soul. And that you could just say, sing it without any limitations of words. So that probably, and I think there's a chassidus about nigunim.
Yeah, there is. Sure, nigunim without words are deeper expression than with words. But what Reza says is also true, that when a tzaddik speaks, the connection is more obvious. The connection between the letters and the deep source versus what the average bloke speaks.
Right, but brain versus heart. Because first, Rosie, you said you have to think, and then you said heartfelt. So that's that's coming from 2 different places.
Okay, let me intervene here. Yes, but Bina liba hobo halev mevin, the Zohar says. Bina, which is a function of mind, right? Before it gets into language, there is a mental, and you're right, this is not speech. But it's a mind function. Bina goes to the heart. And so and there is, like you said, I can hear your words, they were heartfelt. We have that expression, right? You really spoke with your heart. So words can convey heart. And Rosa was saying that amongst the when you were talking, you ever had this with the Rebbe? Probably not too many on this call did, but some I did, others. But you can look at the videos. The words that come out of the Rebbe's mouth, you can feel the heartfulness of them. But they're words, as opposed to raw heart.
I had a question that's not really related, but also has to do with the fact that malachim are that malachim, that Hashem is the king of the malachim, that the malachim are little gods or something. And I don't know if it's connected to, but last week in the parsha it says that a malach took us out of Mitzrayim. And Rashi, do you know that? Do you remember that? And Rashi says a malach, that refers to Moshe. The
No, I
Jews.
don't know this at all because it says in Lay al Yudei Malach.
Exactly. That was my question, actually,
So
because
I don't know.
but
Where did
in the Torah, in Chukas, in Parshas, I think it was Shvi'i, that the Jewish people referred to a malach who took us out of Mitzrayim, and Rashi says the malach, they mean Moshe.
Not familiar with that. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Anything else? Any other beautiful pearls of wisdom and heartfelt feeling here that we're speaking with our mouths? Okay, we'll see you tomorrow. Be well.
Thank you.